Okay, we're going to do our series. When I started this series, when I was naming it, Living Peacefully in a Frightening World, it started out as Finding Peace in a Frightening World. And I thought, no, I want it to be more active, more of a verb, not just finding peace, but what do we do to make peace in a frightening world? And so next week we're going to be talking about finding peace and living peacefully when your life is in crisis. But today we're going to be talking about really making peace on an everyday basis, day in and day out. So we're going to read from the Gospel of Luke, from the church's book, the Gospel of Luke, the 10th chapter. You can pull out your own Bible or Pew Bible, or you can follow it up here. Very famous passage. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" And the man answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." There's another passage in the New Testament which says specifically that Jesus was not a rule breaker. It was not a rule breaker, but he really wasn't quite a rule maker either. He had this wonderful ability to synthesize. He says all the laws of Judaism are combined in these two commandments. And then we go to the 29th verse just to introduce what will come later. "But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer said, 'And who is my neighbor?' And Jesus goes on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. On December the 26th, the day after Christmas, I found myself up north on Coit Road at a gas station, which has incredibly good prices these days. It's almost become enjoyable going to the gas station these days, these prices. I was pumping my diesel truck full of gas. I had been to the ranch. I was in jeans and boots and a Stetson hat. I looked like a redneck. And a car pulled up on the other side of the pump that I was using, and a gentleman got out, African American, wearing a fabulous outfit. It would be hard for me to describe. It was linen and some lace, actually, and it was clear to me that he was going to a party or a celebration, probably a religious celebration of some kind. At first I thought he must be Muslim, but then as I thought about it, and I realized that the suit he had on had what I deemed to be African origins in terms of the design, I thought, I bet he's going to a Kwanzaa celebration. So he pumped his gas and I pumped my gas. We didn't say anything to one another. The pump was in between us. But before he left, he came over to throw a piece of trash in the trash can that was there, and we found ourselves looking at one another eyeball to eyeball. And he looked at me, and with this big smile, he guessed at my traditions, and he said, "Merry Christmas and Happy New Year." I was so caught off guard. I wasn't sure about his tradition, so I just said, "And same to you." And he got in his car and he drove away. It was kind of a moving and remarkable moment for me. I thought, here's this gentleman. I don't think he was celebrating a Christian tradition that day, but he saw me and he guessed at my tradition. He wanted to affirm my tradition. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Here was a man, it was clear to me, who had organized his life around peacemaking. He had organized his civic life and his social life and his personal life and his moral life and his religious life around making peace with his brothers and sisters around the world wherever he found them. It was really an uplifting moment. I got in my truck and I pulled away and I started thinking about this, and I wondered if he was thinking the same thing. This was December the 26th. We were right in the middle of the riots in New York City. Right in the middle of all of this discourse about how America is falling apart, how racial relations are getting worse. MSNBC and Fox News duking it out over who's most responsible for the deterioration in race relations. And I drove away and I thought, race relations aren't getting worse, they're getting better. Because of people on the ground, in the moment, being proactive, reaching out and saying, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Let's make peace, let's be friends. This sermon is pretty simple. If you were to go to sleep right now, I can tell you what the sermon is all about. It's just about making peace on a daily basis, and in so doing, making the world less frightening, your own life more joyful and peaceful. I want to tell you something right now, and I want you to listen to this. It's not from the Bible. This is just Don Underwood, but I truly believe this. We are not going to find true peace, lasting peace in the world because of any kind of negotiation. By that, I mean, I don't think that we're going to find lasting world peace with countries negotiating with one another. I don't think Mr. Kerry or President Obama or some ambassador, I don't care who they are, I don't think they're going to fly over to the East or the Middle East or Europe to Russia and negotiate true and lasting peace. But I do believe we can find true and lasting peace when individuals, people like you and me and the man I met at the gas station, on the ground, take time to make peace with one another, to organize our civic and social and personal lives around the task of making peace, loving God and loving neighbors. When we open our book to this 10th chapter of Luke, we find the story being introduced that is known as the story of the Good Samaritan. And you know how it goes. This man comes to Jesus. He says, how do I find eternal life? Jesus says, love God and love neighbor. It's that simple. But the man, Luke says, desiring to justify himself, says, well, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus tells the story. You know it well. A Jewish man was coming down the road. He got beaten up and robbed and left for dead in the ditch. And along comes a priest, a Jewish priest. And he walks by, leaves him there to die. Along comes a Levite, one of the teachers of the Jews. He walks by and leaves him there to die. And along comes a Samaritan. In order to understand the story, you have to know that Samaritans and Jews were bitter enemies. Think Israel and Palestine. Think Sunni and Shia. However you want to think about it, bitter, ethnic, not just ethnic rivalry, we're talking about ethnic hatred. And the Samaritan comes along and bandages the man's wounds and takes him into town, gets him a hotel room. And it's interesting. Jesus is supposedly answering the question, who is my neighbor? But what he really does tell us in this story is how to be a neighbor. And so what Jesus is really saying is that in order to love God and love neighbor, we have to learn how to be a neighbor. This story is often told by Christians and non-Christians as a story about helping those who are in need, and indeed it is. It's a story about the homeless man. You should help the homeless man who's in need. It's a story about the woman's on the side of the road. She's running out of gas, and you want to stop and help her get gas for her van. It was a story about helping our neighbor, but primarily it is a story about peacemaking. It is about loving God and loving neighbors. It is a story about overcoming deep ethnic hatred and rivalry because of one person who organizes his life around the task of reaching out, making peace, being a friend, being a neighbor. I said a moment ago that I don't think the peace will ever be negotiated, lasting peace worldwide. I think that's true, but I do think we have some remarkable stories about negotiated peace. In 1978, Anwar Sadat was the president of Egypt. Menachem Begin was the prime minister of Israel. Lifelong enemies. Egypt and Israel had spent most of the last several decades at one time or another being in war with one another. And Anwar Sadat woke up one morning and he picked up the phone and he called his enemy Menachem Begin, and this is what he said to him. My grandfathers fought the Jews. My father fought the Jews. I spent a lifetime fighting the Jews. And now my sons are fighting the Jews. I don't want my grandsons to spend their lives fighting the Jews. And Menachem Begin agreed. And they met. And they made peace. The Camp David Accords of 1979, 1980, whatever it was. It wasn't one country negotiating with another country. It was two grandfathers who decided to make peace. In fact, there was terrible resistance in both countries against it. Anwar Sadat lost his life because of it. He was later assassinated by what we today would consider to be an extremist Islamist. And yet, today, after all of these years, Israel and Egypt are still at peace. Are still at peace. Peace happens when individuals have allowed their lives to be formed by their faith in God in such a way that they've organized their lives around reaching out, serving, and making peace. Denise Peckham preached a remarkable sermon on December the 28th. I wasn't here that day. I listened to it by podcast. I encourage you to take advantage of that. It's really easy. I drove up to the ranch one day, put on the earphones, and listened to this sermon. It's a wonderful sermon. It was about peace. And there was a sign, there was a sentence in her sermon that was just so rich and powerful. She said, either we will teach our children the songs of life, or someone else will teach them the songs of death. You think about that for a while. In the events of this past week, the terror and the murders in the city of Paris, the gratuitous violence, and it is clear that we have people in our world who are determined to teach our children, your children and my children, your grandchildren, my grandchildren. They are determined to teach them the songs of death. And we have the opportunity to stand together and teach them the songs of peace. It happens one person at a time, one relationship at a time, one event at a time. Now, in each of these sermons, I'm going to conclude with a word about spiritual practice. I talked about this last week some. If you're going to run a marathon, you want to practice. If you want to learn how to fly an airplane, you practice. You want to learn how to code computers, you practice at it. So if we want to be in love with God and be in love with other people, it requires practice. It's what we call spiritual practice. I'm a type A personality. I'm the first person to tell you that I'm not really the best person to be teaching this. But in the season of Lent, we're going to have a number of people, both on staff and members of the congregation, who are spiritual directors, and we're going to give you opportunities to learn more about spiritual practice. Today, I just want to say a word about the Lord's Prayer, because I've encouraged you to say the Lord's Prayer at the beginning or at some point as a part of your spiritual practice every single day. Back in the fall, when I was preaching a series on recovering the Lord's Prayer, there was an issue that I struggled with and I didn't yet know the answer, and that is, why is the Lord's Prayer said in the plural, and should we, when we're saying the Lord's Prayer individually, should we say it in the personal? In other words, Jesus, when he taught the disciples the Lord's Prayer, obviously there were 12 of them, and so he said, Our Father who art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. And when we say the prayer at a wedding or in our worship service, we say it in the plural. But through the years, and when I've said the Lord's Prayer myself in my personal devotional time, I've been tempted to say it, at least part of it, in the singular. For instance, on this line here, give us this day our daily bread. There have been times when I have confessed to you that I prayed it, give me this day my daily bread. And we talked about what that means. Give me what I need this day, the physical nourishment that I need this day, the emotional and mental resources that I need this day. Give me the spiritual resources that I need to survive and flourish this day. So there's a time it just seemed more personal and powerful to say it in the singular when I was saying it myself. But over the last few months, I've discovered that I was wrong. The Lord's Prayer should always be prayed in the plural. And for the simple reason that we don't go through life by ourselves. So when we say, "Give us this day our daily bread," we can't ask God to feed us without asking God to feed our neighbors. We cannot be effective livers of life or witnesses to the joy of the gospel without holding hands with others. You can't do it by yourself. And so the prayer should always go like this: "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others." I want to share with you an image that just came to me one day when I was praying this prayer. And I encourage you to pray this and take a little bit of time when you come to this part of the prayer. One day I was praying it, and suddenly I tried to imagine what that looks like to say, "Give us this day our daily bread." And I saw myself sitting at a table, a large round table with a piece of bread in the middle, a loaf of bread. And I had gathered around me friends and neighbors. We were holding hands, getting ready to say the prayer. And you can guess who was there: family members, loved ones, neighbors, 2 or 3 people that I had especially been praying for. And it made it a pretty powerful experience as we held hands together and said, "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others." I want to encourage you to try this and to try saying it every day for a period of time. Let me warn you about what's going to happen if you say it every day for enough days. You're going to be sitting there some morning and saying that prayer and thinking about the table and looking at the people around you, and you're going to look up and you're going to see somebody sitting at that table whom you did not invite. It might be somebody you despise. It might be someone you have been unable to forgive. When that happens, just hold hands and say the prayer. And come back and do it the next day and the next. Over a period of time, more and more people are going to show up at that table. And you're going to have to decide whether it is your table or God's table. And if you decide that it is the Lord's table, over time, you're going to find yourself forgiving some people you didn't think you could forgive. And you're going to find yourself falling more deeply in love with God and more deeply in love with other people. And you're going to find yourself living more peacefully in a frightening world.